Sounds good. Okay, good morning, Professor Tootle.
Good morning.
And nice to see you again. Hey, we're joined by your friend again for our second show. When we first interviewed Professor Tom Bruscino, you said, hey, this is so good. We're going to have a second or a third show. And you were right. It was a really good conversation. And so this is our second show. How are you, Professor Bruscino?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you again. You're so formal. Gosh, part of your conversation last time, I listened to the whole conversation last night. It was an hour and a half long, and listened to it from start to finish. And you got most passionate when you were talking about your kids and wrestling and barbecuing and just being a human being. You were pretty passionate about Americans just being good, decent people doing what they're doing. And as long as we're not watching social media and politics, we're actually pretty decent folk. But today you're formal. You must be giving a serious seminar or something.
Oh, we had some interesting meetings today with some folks in the defense establishment.
Ah,
So,
good. Well,
yeah.
hopefully you straightened them out. Hopefully it's not like those other schools that are being interrogated by Congress for their views on the Israeli war and Hamas, but hopefully it was much more not as substantive as that. So, Professor, thanks for being with us again. I'm going to start, and then Professor Tootle's going to just interject whenever he wishes, and he may even take over. But I'm going to start. Since I listened to the whole conversation, I think it was July 22nd of last year. And it's a really decent show. You talked to a lot of different groups, so you probably don't remember, but we talked about the Revolutionary War and kind of the American psyche, and we went into the Civil War, and we talked about kind of some of I forget the right buzzword. Even I listened to it last night, but it was like the maxims of American power or the virtues of power. Neither one of those are right. You'll bring it up again because it seems like it's part of your just normal conversation on this topic. It was really an important conversation. So anyone that enjoys this conversation should go back to July 22nd and listen to the first. This is part two, so to speak, and I bet we will have a part three. I've already given all your credentials on part one, so we're going to skip that and get right to the heart of today's matter. I had you start with the Revolutionary War last time. Today, I want you to start with the the terrorism of Hamas against Israel and Israel's reaction to it, which is, I guess, called a war. Um, can you give some insights from a military perspective? And you might go right into another topic that you had, the difference between policy and military, because this is on U.S. history. So why the heck are we even talking about Israel and Hamas? And I do have an agenda item on that. So I'll be curious to see how you take this general principle. Can you describe what's going on there and what we as Americans should be concerned about?
Well, I'm a historian, so we go backwards. We start in the beginning. I might have did this last time. In the beginning, the Earth cooled, and then
Right.
continents separated, and then the Levant appeared. This part of the world appeared, and they've had their issues for a long time. But let's just sort of bring it up to the modern state of Israel. That's worth.
And maybe you haven't seen no, we should probably do your normal protection for you as a faculty member of where you teach.
Yeah, so I'm speaking for myself here. Nothing I say should
Thank you.
be interpreted as a statement of policy or fact or the position of the U.S. Army War College, the United States Army,
Thank you.
Department of Defense, or the United States government.
Okay, thank
So
you.
yeah, this is those are all sorts of things on this. That said, I feel fairly safe about this. I'll try to be as disinterested as possible, not uninterested, but disinterested as possible about it, and say like from a military perspective, when you look at Israel. Uh, I think the number one thing to understand about Israel is that it's tiny. It's very, very small. And I don't know that people quite grasp just how small Israel is. I mean, we're in the Christmas season, so we can use that as an example. When they walk remember, they walk from Nazareth to Bethlehem, uh, and that's almost all of Israel. So like to give you an idea, it's walking distance, right? A little bit of riding while they're doing it, but it's a very small place. I think total in its area, it's about the size of New Jersey. but even that's a little bit misleading because the southern desert, the Negev, is largely uninhabited, and that's a big chunk of the territory. Been to Israel, did some traveling around it, and we would, it was a part of a group, and we would regularly go. We were staying at a hotel in Tel Aviv. We go from Tel Aviv, drive through Jerusalem, make stops, visit places, go up and visit, some different posts, military posts, up on the Lebanese border. Work our way around, and then we'd be back and in the swimming pool before dinner. Like that kind of thing. 4 or 5 stops, have lunch, do the whole thing. It's very, very small, which means that how Israelis look at their military problem is very, very different than how the United States was. Not only the United States does. Not only is the United States huge itself, it also has one country on one border, a long extended border that we don't really worry about militarily. Canada, Mexico is a slightly different problem, but still a pretty isolated one. And then you have 2 oceans that politically aren't as big as they seem, but militarily are significant barriers, right? So you kind of have to think of that. And then when, if the United States goes and fights somewhere, it's usually expeditionary. We go overseas and build up a lot of stuff and fight in big spaces, right? So we're kind of used to that. Israel has no what we would call strategic depth, none. They don't really have much operational depth either. This would be sort of like fighting depth. So, for example, on the Syrian border, you go up to the and in the '73 war when the Syrians got to the Golan Heights, on the Golan Heights, the artillery can hit everything to the ocean or to the Mediterranean Sea, right? Like that kind of thing, artillery. So you're not not deep airstrikes, not like B-1 bombers. It's organic weapons to divisions. Similar thing. When you talk about where Gaza is and its proximity to very easy range to Tel Aviv for that matter, right? It's close. Everything is very, very close there, which means they have no room to give. So every military threat is existential. Their existence is at stake in every fight, and they have no space. They cannot do the Russian thing and trade space for time. So you have to kind of always keep that in mind when you think about Israel. So when they have to deal with, I'm sure that they would love to have a greater depth than that. And if you think about historically, it was even smaller than that before they had the West Bank, which gives them a little bit more space, but still is nothing, right? From the river to the sea is the common phrase that we hear these days is a very small space. It's maybe a couple hour drive at most. So it's an issue for them, and we always have to kind of think of that. So when you have problems in a place that's right in your yard, not like in your neighbor's one, like Gaza is, the Gaza Strip sticking into them, they don't have much room to play around with. So that's how they have to look at their problems. This is why for them, the walls that they built, the borders, the barriers that they've built, both around the West Bank and around Gaza, are really important. The Iron Dome, the missile and rocket defense system that they came up with, that they developed, is vitally important. And a lot of that provided, so much security for them and such a stable system that they got. And then their internal political issues with the judicial system that they're working on. I think the only reason they were turned to focus on that is because over the last decade plus, it's been a pretty stable security situation, right? So, but what it also means is that if a threat does what Hamas did on October 7th, then their reaction, that their entire focus will turn to that because it has to, and that's what we're seeing with them now. So yes, this is a war for them. It's a war that's hard to define. It's a war that's politically very complex because of external actors who are always have play and great powers who always cause the Israelis always have to balance and deal with. And we're seeing that kind of playing out right now as they push into it, and the sort of, instead of us kind of thinking about sort of dispassionately trying to understand Israeli objectives, what they're trying to get done in Gaza, to Hamas, how they would go about doing that in a very complex situation, what that's going to look like after it's over. Our focus is some sort of trying to figure out proportionality that is counted strictly on how many people are killed relative to what happened October 7th. So,
Go ahead.
Professor, let me ask it in this way, and then you jump in, Professor. But I bet you'll be doing a different take. From a layman's perspective, I don't do any of this nationally and internationally. So just a Colorado citizen, and you talked a lot about Ohio citizens and just people trying to live their lives. And the next thing is on October 7th, our whole Americans' lives changed because we are a tight enough ally with Israel that when they have a brutal, horrific terrorist attack on their soil, I mean, just horrific, all of a sudden we all have to pay attention to Israel, whether we were paying attention to Israel or not, the next day. So I'm wondering how much military history is useful in understanding it for a layman like myself and the rest of all the Americans. I mean, just all of a sudden there's this terrorist attack, and we are such a close ally and so much funding, military funding, and influence, both diplomacy as well as military. Can you give us some insight on that without getting into the realm of Congress, unless that's what to me, it looks like the Democratic Party is going to be as split on this issue as the Republicans are on Ukraine now. And that's another one of my questions coming up. But can you give us any insights that can help add value so when we are talking to our Congress people, we can be smarter? Let me say it in that way. Is there any insights that from the whole history of that region to now, that, hey, John, why don't you be thinking about this?
Oh, so I'll do more ways. So like, it's worth keeping in mind that from the Israeli perspective, by degree, this is I want to put this in a very neutral term as I can. We are at least somewhat responsible for this happening because of the Iraq War. Yeah, so the Israelis for long, we have a ongoing dispute about this. I think that unfortunately in the sort of general narrative that's out there, no doubt we lost in Afghanistan. I think that's a fairly clear case. I would argue we won the Iraq War. From the American perspective, we accomplished the objectives we set out to do in that place. Removed a hostile regime. We set up we helped to develop a country that is at least has an option for a future that is brighter than what they had under the Saddam Hussein regime, and also the potential to be something of a potentially a stabilizing influence in that area, or at least development an ink spot for development in that area. Something that's that's a little bit more of a small L liberal type system that will have an opportunity to be have a good influence in that area, because it's right in the middle, and it's one of the powerhouses. They have massive access to natural resources, obviously with oil, and so hey, there's something good about that from our perspective. The Israelis had an entirely different calculation. All that happened when we got rid of Saddam was that Iran became more relatively powerful. And that's all they cared about, because that's all that they could afford to care about, right? And Iran is the sponsor for Hezbollah and Hamas. That increased the threat to Israel. You could follow on with some of the deals that the Obama administration, the Biden administration picked back up again to allow the Iranian nuclear deals and things like that. That is, also caused some angst for them. But as you say, Israel's in a very difficult position with this when it comes to this, because they don't like to say the stuff about the United States role in this too loud, because we're also their, almost more of a cultural friend than a sort of straight policy friend, right? We see them as a, as we rightly should, as both as a a liberal democratic country in a part of the world that desperately needs more of that, right? And so again, they're generally the good guys in that area. Plus, we have the ongoing, lingering sort of thing of like, hey, that by some degree they're kind of owed that because of the Holocaust and because of the threat of them, the risk to Jews the world over in the diaspora, by not having their own homeland where they could go, and because they historically engendered a somewhat baffling degree of hostility. Which we we talk about all the various reasons for that around the world, anti-Semitism, but which relates into the United States, some United States politics. But now I will say that originally the case for Israel, the creation of the state of Israel, wasn't really driven by the Holocaust. It's more of a sort of post-colonial and facts on the ground based on earlier Zionist movements, and where it was. We think it was a British, it was a British mandate after World War I, and been Turkish before that, not Ottoman before that. So it's had a long, it was a long process of getting to that point. But whether that was an initial thing or not, we still have this kind of lingering thing. Right? We can understand the kind of the Israeli and Jewish perspective of the never again idea, right? And so that is kind of bundled up into it now, and they certainly don't want to violate that. They don't want to push against that. So they don't generally put their fingers in our chest too often and say, this is you're doing by letting Iran become more relatively powerful. But that is how they look at the Iraq situation. And that's understandable. So it's extremely complicated policy issue, diplomatic issue. I also think, and you kind of mentioned this, and I don't want to so if Steve wants to jump in, he can on this. I think this is one of those wonderful case studies of why we used to be smart, why our politics have become so corrupted in so many ways, and why foreign policy, why politics should stop at the at the water's edge for the United States, right? Because we're so in the habit now over the last 20 plus years of every policy issue has to be associated with a party. And in these foreign policy issues, in a lot of foreign policy issues, it just doesn't make any sense to say this is a Democrat thing, this is a Republican thing. And yet we're desperately trying to do that. And it's kind of sort of corrupting our approach to Israel, Ukraine, same thing, right? Same idea of, it just happened. And so what I think you see is, I think you'd pretty safely argue that the differences between administrations with handling the Ukraine issue and the Israel issue are in the margins, and that by and large they're doing the same thing. They're doing the same thing the other party would do. If Donald Trump was president, it'd be similar. We'd be providing support for. It might not have happened because of other issues, but that assumes a degree of American control of issues that is foolhardy to hold, which we often do that one too. Everything's us. Which I certainly don't ascribe. Hey, they make their own choices and do their own things. But I think you could say that a Trump administration will be doing something similar to the Biden administration is doing right now, and that would be the case, Ukraine and Israel. But because it's the opposite party, whichever one it was, I guarantee the Democrats would be because what we're doing now, or at least maybe not Democrats in office as much, but certainly the party, or people who associate themselves with the party, just like people who might not be in office in the Republican Party, but people who associate themselves with the party would be making saying, "Oh, we should never do this," even though it's exactly what we would, whether Democrat or Republican, would have been doing it if they were in power. The foreign policy is it's different that way. But I'll let Steve comment on that if he wants.
Yeah, I guess I would say that I would like to live in this fantasy land where we could actually have more productive conversations. And if I were to, I feel like I want to use your time most effectively here. the things that I hear most often that are incorrect that somebody with your background could address. No, is there such a isn't all warfare asymmetric, or don't you want it to be? What's the difference between war and terrorism? Where's the bright line between, or what are the trade-offs between an unconditional surrender versus a negotiated settlement? How does a conventional army with a sovereign state defeat a border insurgency? These are all the questions that I feel like almost immediately dip into silliness in the public discourse, and it's not like it's not like some of these things don't have answers, that, or at least some kind of consensus on reality, and it might be useful to sort of, I don't know, speak some of this stuff out into the universe. But I don't know which of these things you would want to address first, or which of these apples might seem the most tasty. But where do you want to start biting?
Yeah, so I'll start with war versus terrorism, which is probably a category error, right? They're in different categories. Now, and again, like, so for all of those, the reason why these are all tough is because for all of them, we have some useful definitions, but with an awareness that on the edges there's overlap and gray, right?
And also American
like
values too, right? That we also have to always caveat all this stuff by saying, other countries might have some other value, like Israel values hostages, as a culture in a way that we don't. So we have to always remember, oh, by the way, and we're Americans, right? Before we say some of this stuff.
Yeah, so let's just start with like a very general thing. So, and this is becoming increasingly controversial, and I don't think it should. I think we should keep a very Karl von Clausewitz sort of definition of war, which Americans really like, because they like the idea of his definition of war as a continuation of politics by other means, or policy by other means. Sort of depends on how you want to read politique in German. Regardless, we like that one. We like to focus on the continuation of politics policy, because that makes a lot of sense to us, because our politics are always there and messy, and we do not have an authoritarian government, right? There's always opposition, no matter how just we might think the war is. There's always going to be some opposition. It's always difficult to get everybody on the same page, and we actually, and so we get the sort of messy compromise solutions that are better than any absolute solutions that anybody would suggest on their own, which is the genius of our system. It's also the deliberate inefficiency of our system that drives people mad, because we still have this almost Tolkien-like, we want the king to come back, right, and provide that inspiring leadership, and as humans we want that, and so we have to try to appeal to the better angels of our nature, or develop them.
Or let me quote you back to yourself, something you said in grad school. I forget why. I think you were sick or something, and you said, "I want some." And this is when Dominic, I think, was little, and you looked down at him and said, "I want some giant to come along and pick me up and tell me everything's going to be okay."
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, that's yeah.
I mean, Dominic's now, how old is he? 20 years old. So
yeah, he'll be 20 here in a couple weeks. So so regardless, so we Americans like the politics, continuation of politics part of it, but we tend to de-emphasize that what Clausewitz, part of that point, that was a major point for Clausewitz to make, in his world, which was mostly kings, kings or emperors who could do go about their business and do their thing, and pointing out to them, hey, even when it's an emperor or a king, there's still politics involved, whether you like it or not. So that was a good observation from his part. That observation is, like I said, that's a statement of blinding obvious to Americans, and we latch onto it. The part that we forget is the by other means, and those means that he's describing in that are organized violence,
Yeah.
right? And violent with violent resistance, right? War requires both sides, two sides that are agreeing that that whatever this policy dispute we're having, whether we want to move a border, whether we want to get some sort of sanctions out of people, whatever it is, reparations might be, whatever sort of thing. This policy dispute cannot be settled by normal diplomatic means or economic coercion or whatever it might be. So we decide that we're going to use violence to make this happen. We're going to, kill your armies, take your capital, burn your resources, whatever it might be, kill your people, if you want to be out there. And so, war itself is kind of a unique, it's a discrete American activity, or not American. It's a discrete human activity. It's something different than normal diplomacy, politics, policy. It's by other means. And Clausewitz's argument, which I agree to, I adhere to this, is that when you kind of unleash, when you start using violence, it's not just a continuation of politics. It is a different type of politics. Some might, let's leave that aside. But the
Toodle formulation is that, just at least in the American context, just stop calling it politics. That politics requires the absence of violence. It is the failure and the end of politics, because at least according to how we orient our values, once someone's holding a gun to your head, you are no longer experiencing what we would call freedom. So you have to be free from the threat of violence. Although, of course, we're never, completely free from all threats of all violence, and it's going to influence our choices. But it's one of the things that I think we both do is we really try to emphasize, once you introduce violence, you're talking about something else.
Yes, that's the major point here, is that you are talking about something else. Some other theorists have said that Clausewitz was wrong, and that war is the absence of politics, and that the purpose of war is to get back to politics as usual, so that you can get back to handling these things without violence. What all I'll say, though, is that internal to war itself, when you start using violence, whether or not, politics are still there, policy is still in the background, right? That's still an issue. But the war itself, the way the war is fought, it's fought by different rules than normal policy. It has a different nature than normal political discourse.
So, Professor, this is useful for me, but not practical yet. Is it?
Well, I'm trying to answer the question. Let me get to the question, the sort of question of terrorism. And so war versus terrorism. So what I would say in this case is that what we have to understand is that, let's say, folks like Hamas or Hezbollah do not see their relationship with Israel as a policy, as normal policy. They see it always as war. They're always, violence. They're always planning on using violence to get to their objectives. Now, and their objectives, they're pretty explicit about them. Involve the elimination of the state of Israel and the removal of all Jews, and probably, for that matter, Christians from the Holy Land, if you like. So, what I would say, so what terrorism is, and so this is like really useful to understand this, is that terrorism is Hamas sees themselves at war with Israel. They cannot fight a conventional war against Israel. So they're not using conventional tactics. They're not, using tanks and air power and marching infantry divisions to try to get at this. So what they're trying to use is terrorism is a tactic. Is a tactic of war, right? If you're using it, terrorism is both an act of war, because it often engenders a violent response. So you end up in a fight. Doesn't always. Sometimes it can be, the other side might not decide to, turn that into an actual war, but that doesn't change the fact that from the perspective of Hamas, they're at war with Israel. And until Israel's gone,
so for my layman's perspective, you're describing the worst possible scenario. You've got an adversary that's at war with you, and they're willing to use not only warlike things, i.e., Geneva Convention, but terrorist things. They're willing to use all available with no restrictions. It's the worst possible adversary to have because there just ain't nothing. I mean, it's just you watch out, you close your eyes and you're dead. You turn your back and you're hurt. To me, it sounds like the worst possible scenario for Israelis. Yes or no? Am I hearing you? Or is
Yeah, I mean, it is, but it's also, at least since the, let's say, 1990s, late 80s, into the first Intifada, it's maybe early 80s potentially. Like there's it's just the state of being for them. And the Israelis are, like I said, kind of at the beginning, they're always aware of it. And with the barriers, the walls, and the Iron Dome, it faded more to the background. They had a system in place where they know that the enemy's out there. They know that this enemy is at war with them, and and they've tried from time to time, usually with external pressure, to negotiate, to come up and say, like, hey, maybe if we give them this, then they'll back off. And it's just not the case. Something that Steve says a lot in his stuff, that Professor Tootle says a lot in his stuff, is when people say what they're about, you should just go ahead and believe them. They say what they're about, and the Israelis believe them, what they have to do is kind of manage that conflict.
Okay, so let me ask you one hardball question, then we'll either go to Professor Tootle or another topic. Because this is real world stuff, and maybe would you be a better, like, if the United States woke up and decided we wanted real people in office rather than the political consultant class, would you be a better Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense? What's your expertise?
Wow. Yeah, I'd say so. I think that this is an important issue. I think they're more dramatically different roles than we are kind of drifting towards. We've almost, unfortunately, merged them too much. So if I were doing either, here's what I would say. And I would say this by saying that in both cases, both the Department of Defense and the State Department are wildly complex organizations on their own. So what I would say is that if I were in this, I don't want either of these jobs. So let me just put it that way. This is my massive caveat in front of this. State Department, I would say, I would be very much focused on trying to help the Defense Department be sort of more in its box, be clearer to them about what the role of the military is in our diplomacy. So that would be a kind of key issue, so that the State Department could do its diplomacy. Now, that would be difficult, being the Secretary of State, because there is a massive tension internal to our State Department, which most people don't know about, between what's called Main State, Washington, D.C., the state, the Secretary of State and the bureau chiefs, and the state teams, the appointed ambassadors, and the permanent foreign service officers who are in those in embassies around the world. The embassy folks see themselves as the kind of center of gravity of the State Department. The Main State sees themselves as the center of gravity of the State Department, and rarely the twain shall meet. I won't say never, but rarely do they get along. So like trying to set an overall policy is very, very difficult. A Secretary of State has to be very, very active and go and work with ambassadors in state, because the ambassadors are there day to day, constantly working with the local governments and making deals with them, and helping out with development and all those things that the State Department does. But that's a very tricky job. So State Department, it almost has to be a roadshow for you to be particularly effective. So I think when we think of it in the sort of John Quincy Adams, maybe those days are kind of gone, in sort of historical Secretary of State. Our Secretaries of States are best when they're kind of on the road and really knowing what's happening around and being able to provide good guidance that's actually relevant to the context of the different countries we're dealing with. So there's that one.
So,
On the
so
Defense Department side, I would say something similar. I would put the Defense Department, I think, needs to be much more focused on understanding that it is not the main diplomatic. Our military is all over the world, right? And they do a lot of important engagements with other countries to maintain coalitions and alliances, or maintain alliances and develop coalitions in the event of war. Right, so this is the primary focus of military diplomacy, but it has a way of sort of stepping into State Department, our diplomacy, sort of taking over some of our foreign policy.
Let me see if I can take a stab at this by just repeating or modernizing some of Sherman's language here, which is that war is cruelty and you cannot refine it. And when you're dealing with normal people who want to do normal things, you can that's the State Department, right? If I have a neighbor and I have a dispute with my neighbor, and I want them to cut down a tree, I can talk to them personally. I can maybe show them if they still say no, I can offer to pay for it myself, or I can then, or maybe I can show them the city code, or maybe I can invite an arborist over, in other words, I can escalate all of these things in order to try to achieve what I see as, my ultimate result, which is I want this tree removed. Or I can burn his house down and murder him and his whole family. And that's violence. Now, it doesn't mean that the military is not engaged in normal activities and diplomatic activities, and it doesn't mean that the State Department is oblivious to the fact that violence exists in the world, but our entities have different primary roles. And I think I definitely don't speak for Tom on this, so I'm going to just state my opinion that each of these entities are better when they're thinking about their primary goals, war fighting,
okay,
for defense.
And both professors, this is very, very helpful. I think people that listen to this will find value to this. Let me ask it in a third way now. Professor Bruscino, you're now the National Security Advisor. So I've bumped both of those. Now you're whispering in the ear of the president. And right now, today, I think it's today, the United Nations is making a resolution that will fail, I think, because the US and perhaps other things, but saying that we have to have a ceasefire in Israel. And from my perspective, war/terrorism, that's really useful. But if I was an Israeli and that happened, the 1,700 or 1,200 people were murdered in a day, you can't just ceasefire. You have to track those people down. And whether you do it in a warlike way or a police state way, a police intelligence action, and you have to find out who those people are and who their wraparound apparatus is and who their leadership and who wrote the pamphlets and the how-to. I mean, there's got to be a whole, so you just can't say, oh yeah, you're right, we got to do a ceasefire.
So is Tom in charge of the Israeli military or the American military?
Well, true. So I'm trying to give advice to a very powerful nation. You are. I'm trying to get you to give the American citizens some advice so our president can whisper in their ear. Thanks for the clarification, Professor Tootle. It seems to me somewhat madness on how we're engaging with each other. It doesn't seem rational, actually. A ceasefire, temporary ceasefires to get humanitarian aid in makes sense. Not killing innocent civilians makes sense. But the way it seems like we're talking past each other. The world is talking past each other in this instance. And I'd like you to put some method to the madness. I'd like you to put some wisdom out into the world in what and how we should be thinking about this.
Well, this is a difficult one because I wouldn't, we'd have to deal with my sort of personal proclivities in this case. So like what I would say though, in that if I was in this situation, and what I would try to communicate more clearly as the American government is that, hey, look, I get it. It's on, it leads, it's bleeding, so it's leading. and it's dominating the news cycles every single day, and hey, we get that stuff. This is Israel's problem. This is Israel's war with Hamas, and yes, there are implications, and we are certainly keeping an eye on it. How they go about this war, I would sort of put it in this way: is if Israel decided to wipe out everyone in Gaza, which I don't think that they intend to do or are trying to do, in part of military pressure, like, would we intervene to stop that militarily?
No.
We would say, hey, that's not nice. But like, hey, we should have, as Steve and I were talking about this the other day, there's, it's important for us to have perspective that isn't juvenile or adolescent about
in
issues.
our phone conversation the other day, I talked about the Tibetan freedom concerts that I went to, where I would go into the peace tent and say, listen, we're not going to go to war with China. So what are we doing here? Like, let's enjoy the music. But ultimately, China's using military force to hold Tibet. And if we want Tibet to actually be free, like right now, we would have to say we're willing to kill and die over this. And that's reality. And we're not going to do that. So what I think Tom is saying, or don't put words in your mouth, is like, this is Israel's war. But at the same time, we're in charge of our own foreign policy. They're in charge of their war and their foreign policy, and we're in charge of thinking about what's best for us and our foreign policy and our military posture. We're both sovereign nations. So they get to be in charge of themselves, and we get to be in charge of ourselves, and we'll both, because we have this relationship that and a normal relationship with Israel, we will constantly be reassessing this relationship on a day-to-day basis, just like we do with every other nation on earth.
Right. And it sort of comes down to that. I mean, I think that there's this, it goes back to the point about everything has to have some sort of massive, domestic political implication. But, it just won't. Right. I mean, we're not going to pick a president.
Even though we sent 2 carrier groups there.
Yeah, but I'm talking about domestic political implication. What I'm saying is, yes, there are, excuse me, there are foreign policy, we certainly should be keeping an eye on it. We certainly should be making sure it doesn't try to keep it from spilling over into other places where we do actually have to get involved. Excuse me.
Well, it's not the only conflict that exists in the world. And
right. It's not even, and this kind of relates to the Ukraine one. It's not necessarily the one that we're most concerned with, potentially having to deal with, not by a long shot. It's the kind of thing we have to prepare to be, and be in position to deal with if we must. But that's about as far as it goes. Like Steve said, it's this doesn't, we're not going to pick the 2024, the president in 2024 based on, or let alone, congressmen or senators based on the Israeli war in Gaza. Like they got the fight over Gaza. It's just, there's very few foreign policy issues that have ever, you could find a case where it's ever dictated what happened in American political elections, which is probably as it should be. It's not like,
never forget that most Americans can't name the 3 branches of government.
Right. They're very interesting. And if I'm being my truly cynical, but this is my most cynical take on American history when it comes to presidential politics. But I also think it's accurate. Since at least 1948, the person who's won the election is the person that the American, I think we talk about independence and like winning the people who are going to swing the election. It's whoever's coolest, the coolest candidate. You can check my homework on that, but I can't actually think of an example. And the 2 closest elections that we had besides that were equally cool at the time: Kennedy Nixon and Bush Gore. hard to determine which one of those guys was cooler.
I'm not
Yeah,
sure
especially.
Truman is cooler though.
Yeah, I was thinking about that with Dewey,
Yeah,
but
Dewey was
Dewey
very
had that like comic book villain mustache.
yeah,
You know,
but he was
like
also like a crime fighter and stuff, you know.
yeah, I know it's a tough one. I say 48 is 48. 52 is where it starts for sure. 48 is sort of arguable. Um,
Yeah, but you're
but
right. You know, if you think of cool as being sort of folksy, but
or who they like, who just the American people were like, hey, this is a person I would like to like
yeah, they
me.
couldn't relate to. I mean, and in a way, Dewey was too good. You know, uh, he's
And it might be that one might be just on the sort of fringes of TV and stuff like that where you're really seeing them, you know. But certainly Eisenhower's more cool than Adlai Stevenson. That's a no brainer. Like I said, Nixon and Kennedy in 60 is really close. People forget Nixon didn't have the later Nixon reputation. 64, we'd made Goldwater into a maniac. And then we
yeah.
had what, Hubert and
Well, my favorite cool thing was I want to say I can't remember which election this was. It was when Orrin Hatch was running for president one of the times, and he was up in New Hampshire, and he was talking to a bunch of college students, and they sort of asked him some question that was, you know, I don't remember what the question was, and Hatch's response was, "What you guys need to know is that smoking isn't cool."
right.
I just remember thinking, like, that's the most uncool thing you could have possibly said to a bunch of college students. Yeah,
Right.
okay, Hatch, 2000. Yeah, he told those college kids that smoking isn't cool.
Yeah. So like I said, so like,
He didn't
and
win, by the way.
was that?
He didn't win.
Yeah, no, right. So like, I was just thinking of the examples, like, and even when there's like an uncool candidate, I mean, obviously Reagan blows people out of the water. I think
Yeah,
Gerald Ford was plenty cool, but he had the SNL
great to see
reputation.
that. Cool, yeah.
But then you get like George H.W. Bush, who is decidedly not cool, and they put Dukakis against him. So
Oh,
there you go.
yeah. Yeah.
Like
Whoa. Right.
so like I said, like I think there's like a certain shallowness to American presidential elections, which I generally find amusing. But all back to this
Well,
point
I'd
of
hate
like,
to have the
Yeah, let's get back to the
but
series.
I was about to
and
say
I'd
is that
hate to
when it
have
comes
the
to our
question
foreign
on who's
policy,
cooler between Trump and Biden.
Oh, yeah.
yeah, well, so I think it's an easy case with Trump versus Clinton. I think that Joe Biden's primary characteristic has always been, Joe Cool, right? That was always the kind of,
They
whether
get
it's
into an ice
whether
cream
you
and
buy it or not.
yeah.
And what I say that, so the point being that what I say is that our foreign policy, like we can afford we've forgotten this, but we can afford to be more frank and clear about our foreign policy. We wouldn't like it and we wouldn't care, as we've proven, if the UN can declare whatever the heck it wants,
Yeah.
but certainly, what are they are, at best, or maybe at worst, depending on your perspective, what can the international community do to Israel? At the end of it, they could start calling for war crimes trials if they like. And then who's going to enforce that happening?
Yeah, and also like there are no international law standards that Israel is violating, especially any of the agreements that Israel is actually a signatory to, which people
Right.
kind
So
of
that's always an important thing to remember. So you had mentioned that, John, earlier about the like Geneva Convention. So like one of the things we forget about law of armed conflict, international law, is sort of the origins. And this goes back to an American history thing. So like Lieber's Code in the American Civil War um, is a really good example of this. And we got, like, if you read it, and it is a predecessor for Geneva, Hague Conventions, Geneva Conventions. It's very much built on this. Francis Lieber is one of these kind of key guys for international law. One of the, we forget this about international law, the and law of armed conflict stuff, war law, is that one of the major purposes of coming up with that code in the Civil War was to define for, however you want to put it, irregulars, insurgents, guerrillas, as it were, like, what you could do as a combatant and still be protected. The assumption was not like, we didn't write the code to restrict ourselves, saying the Union, in this case, the United States, the guys in blue in the Civil War. We wrote the code to tell them, if you do these things, you fight out of uniform, you execute prisoners, all these sorts of things without, trials, summer executions, you are no longer protected. Now, when we get you, we're just going to kill you. Right. which is worth keeping in mind with Hamas, because Hamas could care less about it. They haven't signed on any of these conventions. And so really those rules are primarily for them, to understand, like, hey, they're not really protected by hardly any of these rules. Now, to the degree that those are for the, in this case, let's say the counter aggressor, now Israel, it's, like as part of being in good stead in the international community and part of your own moral compass and ethical compasses, you say we're going to generally try to follow these anyway, right? Like the truth is that Israel is being, by international law, if we actually followed it to the letter, Israel could pretty much do whatever they want to the Hamas people, and depending on how you define the civilians in Gaza, the so-called civilians in Gaza, and obviously there are some who really are, and then there's a whole lot who are providing support, that by law, by international law, by law of armed conflict, makes them de facto combatants who don't have protections either. And Israel is still trying to sort among those, right? They don't really have to that much, but they're making an honest effort too. And we should keep that in mind when you kind of look at the balance of this stuff. Proportionate doesn't mean the thing that's going on in the news right now, which is the numerical comparison.
Right. That's not what those words mean.
Yeah, that's so I was like, I like to kind of keep that in mind. And again, that's something worth communicating to people. Hey, we applaud. I think the way that I would characterize it is we applaud Israel, and this would be this is kind of a warning. It's an encouragement, but I would put it in these terms because it would be a better communication of the message. We applaud Israel for their ongoing efforts to discriminate and be proportional in their fight. Their ongoing efforts, the thing they're already doing, we say, hey, keep doing that as you're dealing with an enemy that doesn't deserve those protections.
I got a big question for you, one that we've been talking about for 25 years. How do you defeat an idea? How do you use the military to defeat an idea?
I think you use the military to set the conditions where the better idea can win. Right. So so this is an important one, right? Like I've been thinking about this a lot with some of the criticisms of, say, like Zelensky is not a bad one, but like anyone, it doesn't matter.
I was just gonna, civil war. How do you defeat the idea that you can, not recognize that you live in the United States? World War II. How do you defeat the idea that that Nazism gets to survive in the world? How do you defeat the idea of Japanese militarism? How do you defeat the idea of communism?
Yeah, so I'll give you, this is what I meant by the example of you set the conditions so that a better idea can win. Yeah. And the better idea is ours, because ours is universal, based on first principles that are true and good and beautiful. I'll put it that way, transcendental in what they are. And whether or not we live up to them perfectly or not, they are still the ideas to which we hold. And so, but trying to insert those ideas, militarily is impossible. So you set the conditions, whereby they can grow, and that's the important thing. So, what that might mean is that you get a Syngman Rhee in South Korea, and for a long time during the Cold War, that was one of those examples of us, it's just as bad. Well, number one, it's not just as bad, and it never was, because the ideas to which he in his sort of authoritarian, or Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, right, is another example, in their sort of authoritarian system, there was still room for the ideas, right? There was still space that was created, and you needed, like, and your security, the security allows for that, military security, right? The defense, as the big word, big D, defense. And so it allows for that idea, allows for these good ideas to come up. And I think that the historical record shows that is it's slow but wildly effective, right? Where would you rather be, Taiwan or mainland China? Where would you rather be, South Korea or North Korea? Mm-hmm. You ask the question, it answers itself, right? Yeah. It's not hard. Like, and you say, like, and I would even argue that where would you rather be in Syngman Rhee's South Korea, or in Kim Il Sung's North Korea, or in Chiang Kai-shek's Taiwan, or Mao Zedong's mainland China. Again, so even when it was nasty, it was still better because it was allowing room for the idea. And you can do military things to set the conditions for that to happen, to keep the bad ideas out.
This, but Frederick Douglass's letter, or I'm sorry, speech, where he uses this metaphor of like who comes aboard the ship of state and what's allowed to compete on that ship. And he says, when the slave owner joined the ship of state, they knew they had to take their chance with free speech existing, and they knew that abolitionists already existed in the United States. But I wonder, I'm literally just thinking of this for the first time, so this might be completely crazy, but this idea of like when we support bad guys, we conceive of this ship of state, who's going to come aboard and what this ship is going to be like. And we don't say, oh, this is the good ship Lollipop with being guided by Jesus Christ and the Dalai Lama. But I'd rather be on this ship than this one.
Right.
It's
and you can put guns on your ship to make sure that they don't board from the other one.
Right.
And that's kind of that's what you're doing, and even in a counterinsurgency, it's like, hey, we exclude them. This was the problem in Vietnam, South Vietnam, that we often miss. It's the Vietnam War is really an invasion of South Vietnam by the North Vietnamese communists. You look at an example of the Viet Cong, and you'll find, the argument at the time was that this was a self-generating South Vietnamese movement, which is nonsense. To the degree that it was only because there were guys with, often Russian or Chinese names, along with North Vietnamese people in those villages with guns pointed at people saying, you're going to join up. And then there were young people they convinced, because young people are convincible, to join in and be true believers in the ideology. But, Vietnam would have been better off with Diem staying in South Vietnam would be better with Diem staying in power. Is like, he was kind of a bastard, but he was a bastard who was allowing room for other ideas. And we know that because those other ideas were coming out, whereas in more authoritarian, totalitarian systems like the communist ones, you're not allowed to have those other ideas.
So right? Before we open it up to Susan and Bart and John again, I just want to, another thing I've been thinking about the last couple of weeks that I haven't had a chance to talk to you about is the transnational border incursions, that book that you did. Mm-hmm. And it was useful in the Iraq War. I don't know if you want to tell the story of what that, what those occasional papers were and what that book was and how it was actually used in war fighting, potentially. But if you want to answer that, you can. But I also want to know, are there any lessons in that book that you would think are relevant to the war between Israel and Hamas?
Well, certainly. I mean, that's the point of the barrier system, right? Like, that was the whole point of it, is we need to
first explain what the book was and how it came about, and then what the idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, when we were, it was about a transnational sanctuary and in primarily counterinsurgency type wars, small wars, the ability for an external power to put, another major power or minor power to use open borders to insert, people, material, ideas, and the military power behind the ideas that are contravailing to what you're trying to have in a country to provide for that country's internal stability.
But who asked for that book to be written, and when was it published, and why?
Oh, geez, when was that published? 2006, I think, 2006 or 7. It was published. It was, the Iraq War, and so I used example. I'm trying to remember what I used in that one. I definitely did Vietnam. I'm trying to remember what the other ones I used. I think I did Afghanistan.
Didn't you do Mexico and Philippines?
I ended up not using the Mexico. one in that.
Oh.
I published that as a separate article about the Mexican border and the Pancho Villa and all that.
Yeah.
So I did Afghanistan and the Soviet case and their inability to keep the borders closed, you know, from the south, from Pakistan primarily, and a little bit from Iran, and then Vietnam, obviously, with Laos, Cambodia, were the main issues there. With it, you know, the obvious implications both for Afghanistan, but at the time primarily focused on Iraq and dealing with, you know, Iran to some degree, but at the time more Syria, Jordan problems, particularly Syria. Syria was the sort of rat line for folks coming in for the kind of global Al Qaeda effort against the, you know, attempting to build a new and better government in Iraq. So, I mean, it's the same. Like they're persistent, right? And Israel is obviously well aware of this. This is the whole point of the border. Like, hey, if we can keep the bad actors out, you know, this will, like I said, you know, the best. You know, Israel doesn't go on the road, right? Judaism isn't a proselytizing religion. They're not trying to convert people by definition. It just isn't, right? It's not. Yeah. It's not how Judaism works, and it's not how the state of Israel works. They're not trying to expand to the degree that they've expanded. It's for like military security purposes, and then they've given some of that. You know, go Sinai, for example, back, and Gaza Strip is another one, right? Like so, governed by other or populated by other people. And rather than try to move all those people out or try to convert all of them, they've walled them off. And, you know, and for good reason, because as noted before, Hamas is at war with them. You could argue that the PLA is more minorly, but also at war with them. And Hezbollah certainly is too. So that's the way that they kind of look at their problem. So yeah, the transnational thing is it all goes to the same idea. How do you win an idea? You know, how do you defeat an idea? You know, you create the space for a better idea, and our idea, and I think Israel's idea, is a highly compelling one. This is something Victor Davis Hanson talks about a lot. You know, if you were really to sort of pin down somebody on the street, you ask them like, where would you rather live? You know, in the Gaza Strip or in Tel Aviv? You know, well, hey, you know, a lot of or on the West Bank. You know, in the more Palestinian areas, well, we know because thousands of people a day go through checkpoints and go work in Israel, where they have opportunity and development stuff. And the premise is, and you know, for that part of the world, I don't know if it's ever going to be solved. You know, probably not. But we could hope that, you know, enough of those people do that for enough time and have good enough lives that they start saying, hey, you know, this is just a better idea. Why don't we live this way? Instead of orienting ourselves around hostility towards another people based on their religion and ethnicity.
Agreed, Professor, that it's a better idea. I'm not convinced, though, that it's a more common idea. It seems like human nature is prone to tolerating autocratic or dictatorial regimes in their societies. It seems like
yeah, and I think the main driver for that is often a very sort of tribal mentality. You know, the sort of us, which is a very, very human instinct to do, and which is at the core of the American experiment, right? Is this idea of saying we're not going to organize ourselves around tribes. We're going to organize ourselves around the inherent worth and value of every human being. You know, because we believe they're created in the image and likeness of God. Right? So like that.
Now, forgive me for jumping in again, but it looks like we're almost out of time for both of you, and it would be kind to allow Susan and Bart to jump in with any question or comment they might have for you. So, Susan?
Good morning and greeting from Southern California.
Hello.
Hi there.
And I was just enjoying listening because I like a lot of the professor's ideas and suggestions. And one of the things that really resonated with me was the fact of acknowledging the fact that we as Jews are not missionaries. We don't go out proselytizing. We don't go out trying to convert people. And yet it seems politically on the far left, they keep on talking about how Jews and Israelis, because they're kind of intertwined, are trying to be colonial, using the word colonial as if somehow we are this people that go in the way the, Spanish did with the Mayans and try to convert them. And that's just not it. The whole point is we need that barrier to protect Israel's security and safety. And that just the way he phrased it and everything was such a good argument against what I hear from the extremists about Israel being colonial. So I really appreciated that because it put into words what I was thinking in a really very helpful and concise way. Obviously, I'm pro-Israel because I have said that in this meeting before. And so, and I think that a ceasefire is a terrible idea because Israel might do it to their detriment. Hamas will not, in the same way as Hamas was saying it's impossible that they raped women because it's against the Quran. And my argument is, well, which religion promotes rape of women? So trying to hide behind that, it's just, there's just so much out there in the press that is just so distressing. Anyway, that's my comment and my appreciation for this morning's meeting. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, can I make a follow on to that? I appreciate it. I'm glad you like that. I think the idea that the sort of hump we have to get over in the Middle East is that Israel is what we're hoping for Israel. We say this more clearly, and I would say, by degree for Iraq also now, is that we want to convert people by example, not by colonialism would be a good way of saying, not by taking it on the road, not by force. But the threat, I think what the problem that we have with that is that I think that when we say that convert, what we're talking about converting them to is a small L liberal perspective of the world, built around and rule of law and those sorts of things, as opposed to converting them to Judaism, right? Like they're not like just like we're not trying to convert use Iraq to convert people to Shiaism or Sunniism. It's to convert them to a liberal idea by example, by example. But I think that the leaders of the folks who are hostile who develop hostility towards Israel, like they characterize it as a conversion to potentially like Judaism, as opposed or the worst excesses of liberalism, right? Which there are plenty, and which we deal with, persistently for ourselves. They say, hey, look, we have traditions and ideas, and you're saying to convert us to this system, and then coming out of this is that we'll get, all of the social issues that we fight over in the United States between a very conservative religion that is Islam in most of its forms, socially, what we would call socially conservative in the United States context, but for them, same thing, right? We don't want, because what comes with that liberalism you're trying to, convert us to by example, and we know how intoxicating it is. We know our people go and bring this back. We know our kids want to listen to terrible American pop music and watch these, awful movies that have all this, sex and violence and things like that we don't really want to, expose them to. And so like, that's kind of the problem, but I think they characterize it more around their sort of religion ethnicity issue. And that's where they really get a lot of traction with it. It's a problem, right? And like I said, it's the Churchill line. Our system is the worst except for all the rest of them, right? Like, it's the best system except for all the rest of them. And, so that's our sales pitch.
Very helpful.
It's also the lived experience of people. It's like, hey, for all of those problems, this is still better than the alternative that we often live with. So thank you.
Very helpful context, Professor. Bart, you have just a quick 30 seconds, probably.
Yeah, I just want to thank Tom for being on. I think that this was a fantastic discussion. Tom and to some extent Stephen, your grasp of the Middle East situation is fantastic. And I wish there were a way to make it so that average Americans understood the complexity of the Middle East. And I think largely, that's a pipe dream. I don't think it's going to happen. But I think it's amazing, to listen to your grasp of kind of what's going on there and how it affects us. And I'm like Susan, I'm Jewish. So obviously I'm pro-Israel. But I'm an American, so I know the geopolitical interests of the United States as well. And it kind of that aspect of it worries me, because I don't know that the average American understands kind of what's going on in the world, writ large. And I think it's a real problem. And having discussions like this really helps in terms of educating. I know there's only 5 of us on, but hopefully people will listen to this.
Yeah. Well, I
Agreed.
think if I can speak about, Tom and I have been friends for many years, and I think it, and Derek Katzum, who was on a couple weeks ago as well, and we've had Jeff Bloodworth on here, and one of the things that I think that we all share in common is that we believe in getting the big ideas right first. Because the key to being able to handle complexity is to understand the basic concepts first. And I think our friendships are often based on, and it's why we can have disagreements over the years about the small things, because we realize that the big things are the important things. And we can hope that every person on earth is safe and prosperous and free. And we can recognize that the more people on earth who are safe and prosperous and free, that's actually good for our national security. But we also realize that we live in an imperfect world, and we have to take the world as we find it each day. And just wrapping your head around those big ideas gives you, I think, a framework for understanding crises as they arise. I mean, that's one of the things that Lincoln said in that fragment on Constitution and Union that I always describe to my students as, get your head straight, so that when the emergency arises, you know what you're going to do. Think about it first, and then let the emergency come.
Professor Bruscino, you get one last bite at the apple. It can be as simple as a goodbye or a thought that hasn't been expressed yet.
Oh no, I just wanted to thank you for having me. Appreciate it. I'm glad. Hey, if it's 5 of us, that's better than 0, right? We'll take our be grateful for these things, especially in this season. So, happy Hanukkah to you too, and Merry Christmas to everybody else in this season. We could use some more of that, I think, right?
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, well done. Thank you for your thoughts. I'll try to think of other job descriptions besides Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, or National Security Advisor.
Yeah.
Did we ever actually mention that
less
he's
scary
a professor
promotions
of history at the Army War College? That I don't know if we ever actually said that, but you are a professor of history at the Army War College, right?
So I am a professor of the Army War College.
It's probably one of the best jobs there.
For whom
your thoughts are valuable. Thank you.
Yeah, but he does not
Right.
speak to them. Right.
All right.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Appreciate
it, friends. Have a good day. Hope to see you.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Off to our